Between 1900 and the 1950s, Native American rights in the United States were largely characterized by a policy of forced assimilation, with the government actively attempting to dismantle tribal sovereignty and integrate Native Americans into mainstream society through land allotment, boarding schools, and later the Indian Termination Policy, which aimed to end federal recognition of tribes and relocate them to urban areas, often resulting in significant loss of cultural identity and economic hardship for Native Americans. During this period, Native Americans faced much cultural suppression and loss of land.
The American Indian Movement, 1960s. The federal government's termination policy in the 1950s aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society by encouraging relocation from the reservations to urban centers. This policy led to more challenges, including racial profiling and limited educational opportunities, which the American Indian Movement sought to address. The American Indian Movement was established by Ojibwe activists Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, Eddie Benton Bonnet, Pat Belanger, and George Mitchell. The American Indian Movement initially focused on addressing systematic issues like poverty, discrimination, and police brutality against American Indians in urban areas. The American Indian Patrol monitored police interactions with Native Americans in Minneapolis to prevent abuses.
Indian Civil Rights Act, 1968. In 1968, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed. Through the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, ICRA, Congress statutorily imposed on tribal government provisions similar to those found on the Bill of Rights. Commonly known as the Indian Bill of Rights, the ICRA provides protections similar but not identical to those provided by the U.S. Constitution. It overall protected individual civil rights in Indian country. It did this by prohibiting tribal governments from taking actions that might interfere with individual freedoms. Alcatraz protests, 1969 to 71. In 1969, Native American activists occupied Alcatraz Island to protect the U.S. government's treatment of Native Americans. The occupation lasted from November 1969 to June 1971. The federal prison on Alcatraz had been closed for 6 years, and the 89 protesters aimed to occupy the island, stating that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie required that unused federal land be given back to Native Americans. The occupation was led by Richard Oakes, a Mohawk Indian, and a group called Indians of All Tribes. The group demanded the government stop taking land from Native Americans and build a center on the island to replace the American Indian Center in San Francisco. The occupation led to federal laws that protected Native American land rights and cultural freedom. It also inspired the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973.
The sterilization of Native American women by the U.S. government by the Indian Health Service in the 1960s and 1970s revealed the troubling time in the federal management of Native American reproductive rights. These federal policies were made to try and control the Native populations and were influenced by beliefs about poverty, race, and reproductive rights. These procedures were conducted without consent or proper information, showing how the government was trying to control Native childbirth and family planning. In the 1910s, the government's goal was to shift childbirth from midwives to hospitals under the supervision of the government, to try to control the reproductive rights. By the 1960s and 1970s, the government had significant power over how and where Native American women gave birth. During this time, many women were not informed at all, coerced and misled about the outcomes of the procedures. It is estimated that 1 in 4 Native American women who could conceive children were forced to sterilize during this period, leading to a significant impact on the Native community. The sterilization by the U.S. government reflected a huge violation of human rights, leaving lasting trauma on thousands of women.
The Wounded Knee Occupation, 1970s. December 29, 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred in Wounded Knee Creek, Pinewood Reservation, South Dakota. Around 350 Lakota Sioux were intercepted by the U.S. 7th Cavalry while attempting to move to safety. The cavalry opened fire and killed 250 through 300 Lakota. In the 1970s, there were tensions on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation due to allegations of corruption and abuse of power against tribal president Richard Wilson. On February 27, 1973, about 200 activists, including Oglala Lakota and American Indian Movement members, seized and occupied the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, on the Pinewood Reservation. They chose the Wounded Knee because of its history and how the 1890 massacre showed the government's broken promises. The occupiers called for the removal of Richard Wilson from office and sought the U.S. government's commitment to honor existing treaties with Native American tribes. In reaction to the occupation, the government deployed U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and other law enforcement to surround Wounded Knee to a 71-day standoff. 2 Native Americans were killed, Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Lamont, as well as a U.S. Marshal, Lloyd Grimm. The confrontation concluded May 8, 1973, after 10 weeks of negotiations and paramilitary actions. The occupiers surrendered their arms, and the U.S. Marshal Service took control over the town.
President Reagan Indian Policy Statement, 1983. In 1983, President Reagan issued an Indian policy statement signaling that the administration's belief in local control applied to tribal governments alongside their state government peers. Reagan's policy statement reaffirmed the administration's intent to deal with tribes on a government-to-government basis and underscored a maturing policy of self-government for tribes without threat of termination. NCAI stood at the forefront in the environmental area as tribes increasingly sought control of environmental protection and resource management. Passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988 ushered in a new era of opportunity and challenge for tribes.
The Violence Against Women Act, signed in 1994, was a crucial part of women's rights, but excluded a major marginalized group, Native American women. Native American tribes often had their own laws, cultures, and systems of government. These laws were often not in favor of their women. In fact, they have minimized the protection of many Native women against domestic abuse. The laws on tribes have made it hard for many women to come forward about their abuse. Whether the women wanted help from the tribal government or non-tribal governments, there were many blurred lines between both. It all began with stories like Diane Millix, a Native American woman from the Southern Ute tribe on a reservation in Colorado, living with her non-Native husband. Once they had gotten married, she experienced extreme mental and physical abuse from him. She was hit, beaten, degraded, and often threatened with murder. He went even as far as showing up to her workplace with a gun and promising to kill her. Unfortunately, this was not uncommon during this time, yet it was rare to see that these women have gotten help until recently. As the Violence Against Women Act did not exclude Native American women, it did not save them either. Millix knew she was in danger. Desperate to get out of the situation, she called the cops hoping they would save her. However, the one drawback that prevented her from putting her husband behind bars was the gray area between tribal governments and non-tribal governments. Since Millix's husband was a non-native, tribal officers could not arrest him. The Colorado police did not have jurisdiction over tribal land, yet all the abuse was committed on tribal land. Unfortunately, many Native women have missed out on the opportunity to have the same freedoms due to their abusive relationships. It is relatively tragic considering how mistreated Native American women were and still are. The Dakota Access Pipeline, constructed by Energy Transfer Partners, is 1,100 miles long and transports crude oil from the North Dakota Bakken Field to Illinois. It crosses important bodies of water like the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and Lake Oahe. Lake Oahe is located near the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Due to the pipeline being so close to the reservation, it has raised concerns over the environmental and cultural impacts. While most of the pipeline was approved by the state law, 37 miles of the pipeline are under federal oversight by the Army Corps of Engineers. The pipeline has faced many oppositions from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe due to the fear of contamination of water from potential oil spills. They fear if there was an oil spill, it would affect the tribal water and the sacred sites. Others support the pipeline, arguing it is safe and has a technologically advanced way to transport oil. More recently, the controversy of the pipeline has called for a federal response. In Obama's presidency, his administration halted construction in 2016, but later the Trump administration resumed it in 2020 amongst the environmental and legal reviews. For the Navajo Nation, COVID-19 hit enormously. Over time, it had begun to close the tribe in, making it hard to live life day to day. With COVID overtaking the Navajo Nation, there were also many restrictions in order to get from place to place. For instance, stores and shopping centers were at least 50 minutes away. Public health facilities and access to these facilities were limited and outdated. Social distancing especially became an issue for celebrating Native customs. Culturally, Native American tribes often gather together for tribal ceremonies. However, due to the COVID restrictions, many may not comply or ignore the rules due to the issue of not being able to practice sacred cultural rituals. Additionally, many were dying due to the illness, causing depression and increased drug and alcohol abuse within communities. The Native American people had also received less help from the federal government compared to the aid given to other states and began to struggle economically. Soon, many major businesses began to close down, leaving people without income and increasing the poverty rates. The rising poverty rates contributed to the healthcare difficulties of the people, who often could not afford healthcare and were at risk for getting 10 times more sick due to the lack of clean drinking water and resources, as well as being more prone to severe illnesses. Although, after many trials and tribulations, the U.S. government had realized they were not providing enough care for every community during COVID. So, in order to reach those communities, the CARES Act was utilized for Native Americans in the Navajo Nation. CARES, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, was a bill passed in response to economic burnout due to COVID-19. The government gifted the Navajo Nation $714 million for aid, but even after helping the tribes, there is still a tension between the native and non-native governments as they vastly contrast each other.
Our predictions for where we think this movement is going for the first half of the 21st century. We predict that in the future, many Native Americans will face risks related to environmental problems. Problems like water contamination, dumping, air pollution, mining waste, and climate change. Helping tribes protect the environment should be one of our top priorities. In Alaska, the impact of climate change is immediate and immense. Additionally, Native Americans have been neglected in the past by our government. However, recently the United States has fortunately undertaken a unique trust responsibility to protect and support tribal nations and their citizens through treaties, statutes, and historical relations with tribal nations. And through all of this, we know that no matter what, Native Americans will continue to fight for their rights, land, and freedom. You can help this movement by joining us in the fight to preserve Native American heritage at www.preservenativeamericanheritage.com.